In a suburban house, surrounded by tall trees and well-kept gardens, lived a seemingly happy and balanced family. The mother, Lucia, was a woman in her mid-40s, with a kind and affable character, known for her dedication to her home and her role as a mother. Her husband, Raoul, was a hard-working man, but with a somewhat distant presence in family life. His career as an executive in a large company kept him busy, and he often traveled for weeks at a time for work. Although he loved his family, the long hours of work and his time away from home had made him a somewhat absent character, a figure that Lucia trusted, but whom she rarely saw. Lucia and Raoul's daughter, Sofia, was 18 years old and was the center of her mother's life. She was a happy young woman, full of dreams and goals, and she had managed to build a very special relationship with her mother. There were no secrets between them, and they used to spend the afternoons sharing moments together, from going shopping to sitting in the kitchen talking about life and the future. Lucia saw in Sofia a younger version of herself, and tried to advise and guide her through every important step in her life. The arrival of Martin, Sofia's boyfriend, brought a new energy to the house. Martin was a young man of 20, charismatic and with a personality that quickly won over the family. From the first moment, Sofia felt deeply attracted to him, and soon they began a relationship that quickly became serious. Martin used to visit them often, and both Lucia and Raoul always welcomed him with open arms. Lucia saw him as the perfect complement to her daughter, polite, respectful and affectionate, someone who would clearly do everything possible to make Sofia happy. The first months of Sofia and Martin's relationship were like a dream come true. Lucia was happy to see her daughter so in love, and Raoul, despite his somewhat absent character, was also happy to see his daughter in such good company. Martin, with his natural charm and genuine way of being, seemed to fit perfectly into the family. During dinners at home and family outings, Lucia could not help but notice how attentive Martin was with Sofia, how thoughtful and considerate he was. Over time, Lucia began to see qualities in him that reminded her of the youth of her own marriage. However, as the months passed, something unexpected began to arise in Lucia's heart. At first, she herself did not understand why, but every time Martin was near, she felt a strange restlessness, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that unsettled her. At first she thought it was just a passing thought, something unimportant, but soon she noticed that these feelings grew in intensity. Every time Martin spoke or laughed, she watched him with an attention she could not explain. She began to notice details in him, from the way he smiled to the sparkle in his eyes when he looked at Sofia. Lucia tried to ignore these feelings, convinced that they were meaningless and that everything was the result of a personal crisis, perhaps the loneliness accumulated by Raoul's absence and the demands of daily life. However, it was becoming increasingly difficult for her to look away from Martin, and in the moments when he spent time with Sofia at her house, she found herself waiting for him to address her, for them to exchange glances, as if those small moments of attention gave her some sort of secret satisfaction. As her feelings grew, Lucia began to feel trapped in an internal conflict she had never experienced. On the one hand, she loved her daughter and wanted her to be happy with Martin. On the other, every time he was around, she couldn't help but feel a kind of attraction that made her question herself and her own marriage. She knew it was wrong and that she should keep her distance, but for some reason, she couldn't completely control herself. One of the moments when Lucia began to notice his change was during a summer afternoon, when Martin arrived at the house to pick up Sofia. She wasn't ready yet, and Martin waited in the living room with Lucia. It was a common scene, one of those casual situations that shouldn't mean anything, but at that moment, Martin's closeness and the fact that they were alone made her feel a strange connection. As they chatted about trivial topics, Lucia found herself looking at Martin with a different attention. He seemed relaxed and natural, but Lucia felt her heart beating fast, and something inside her stirred every time he smiled at her or looked into her eyes. From that day on, Lucia began to look for excuses to be near Martin when he visited the house. Sometimes, she offered to prepare something for them, or she joined them in a casual conversation. She tried to convince herself that she only wanted to get to know him better for the sake of her daughter, but she knew there was something more behind those excuses. Every moment she spent with him filled her with a kind of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. The connection she felt with him was a mix of excitement and guilt that tormented her, but which she couldn't shake off. Over time, Martin also began to notice Lucia's special attention. At first, he interpreted it as a sign of kindness and interest in his relationship with Sofia. But little by little, he began to perceive something more in Lucia's gaze, in her way of addressing him, in those moments when they seemed to be the only two in the room while Sofia was away. Although he did not want to admit it, Something in him also felt a certain curiosity for Lucia, an unexpected attraction that began to awaken as a result of these encounters. The small gestures were transformed into signals. Lucia sought his gaze, she was attentive to every detail, and Martin responded unconsciously, also trapped in a web of emotions that he could not define. The tension between them began to become palpable, although both tried to hide it, aware that any misstep could lead them to a situation from which they could not escape. The spark was lit, and both knew that what they felt was wrong, but the attraction became a constant presence between them. With this growing tension, the family atmosphere that was previously so warm and harmonious began to fill with dark and uncomfortable nuances. Lucia was becoming more and more nervous and aware of her feelings for Martin, while he, although he tried to ignore it, could not help but think of her with a mixture of intrigue and desire. Sophia, completely oblivious to what was happening, continued to be happy and in love, without suspecting that the man she loved and her mother shared a secret attraction that would soon break the peace of their home. Over time, what had begun as a silent and inexplicable attraction between Lucia and Martin became a secret relationship full of tension and desire. Despite their initial attempts to control their feelings, they had both let themselves go, knowing full well that their actions were placing them in a delicate and dangerous situation. However, danger itself seemed to be one of the reasons that fueled the intensity of their relationship. The first furtive encounter occurred one afternoon when, by chance, they found themselves alone at home. Raoul was away on a work trip, as was often the case, and Sophia had gone shopping with friends. Lucia and Martin had crossed paths in the living room while he was waiting for Sophia. The conversation began in a trivial manner, full of small jokes and friendly remarks. But at one point, a long pause fell over them, and they both looked at each other in silence, understanding without words the bond that had brought them together so unexpectedly. Lucia approached Martin and, without thinking much, gently caressed his face, a gesture that he did not reject. He responded by putting his arms around her, and in an instant, they shared their first kiss, an act that broke all the moral and emotional barriers that had held them back until then. It was a brief kiss, but full of a meaning that they both understood. They were crossing a line of no return. After that first kiss, the complicity between them grew stronger and stronger. They took advantage of any opportunity to see each other alone and keep their relationship a secret. They met in remote places, sometimes during times when Sophia was at university or when Raoul was away. The clandestine romance became an addiction for both of them, a mix of adrenaline and passion that gave them a kind of escape from their daily lives. Lucia began to find excuses for Martin to visit the house more frequently, and Martin, always willing, adapted to every opportunity. They began exchanging messages and calls on the sly, arranging times to see each other when Sophia was not home. Deep down, they both knew what they were doing was wrong, but the attraction was too strong and drove them to continue. With each encounter, Lucia felt younger and more alive. Martin awakened in her an emotion and passion that she had not felt in years, and, despite her awareness of the consequences, she did not want to stop. In her mind, she tried to justify their relationship, telling herself that she deserved to feel desired and loved. Each moment with Martin became a forbidden treasure, a kind of refuge where she could forget about her role as mother and wife. Martin, for his part, began to experience an internal conflict. He knew that he loved Sophia and that she did not deserve the betrayal he was causing her, but the connection with Lucia was irresistible. Every time he tried to end the romance, he fell back into Lucia's arms, seduced by the intensity of their encounters and the bond they had secretly built. At the same time, he began to feel trapped in a situation that seemed to have no clear way out. The relationship between the two began to affect family life in subtle but increasingly evident ways. Lucia and Martin behaved naturally in front of Sophia, but the tension was palpable. The exchanges of glances, the knowing smiles and the prolonged silences became their own private language, one that only they understood and that gave them a unique connection. However, these interactions began to raise suspicions at times, although Sophia, oblivious to the truth, attributed these changes in her mother's attitude to simple coincidences. One day, during a family outing, Sophia noticed that her mother and her boyfriend seemed too close. Lucia laughed differently when Martin spoke, and he looked at her with an unusual intensity. Although Sophia tried not to give it importance, a feeling of discomfort began to settle in her mind, a vague suspicion that she could not understand. Still, she decided to ignore it, thinking that maybe she was being too sensitive or that her mother was just trying to be nice to her boyfriend. Lucia and Martin continued their relationship in secret, taking advantage of every moment to meet in secret and share those moments that had become vital for both of them. With each encounter, the intensity of their romance increased, and the complicity between them made them feel as if they were in a bubble, isolated from the outside world. It was a kind of dangerous game, a non-verbal pact that united them in a secret that they believed they could keep forever. However, reality was beginning to catch up with them. Lucia felt that, although her relationship with Martine gave her a kind of emotional satisfaction, it also filled her with guilt and fear. Every time she saw Sophia smile or express her love for Martine, something inside her broke a little more. She knew she was betraying her own daughter, but the attraction to Martine was so powerful that she could not stop herself. Martine, in turn, began to feel increasing pressure in his life. His secret relationship with Lucia kept him in a constant state of anxiety and fear of being discovered. Every time he was alone with Sophia, the weight of guilt tormented him, and although he tried to convince himself that he should end his romance with Lucia, the mere thought of losing those forbidden moments was unbearable. The tension finally reached a tipping point when Sophia decided to host a small dinner at home to celebrate her anniversary with Martin. Lucia, caught in a mix of emotions, was caught between love for her daughter and desire for Martin. During dinner, the awkwardness became palpable, and the tension between Lucia and Martin became evident to Sophia. Seeing the way her mother looked at her boyfriend and how he looked back at her, she began to suspect that something strange was going on. That night, as everyone prepared to say goodbye, Sophia confronted her mother, asking her if something was going on between her and Martin. Lucia tried to play it off, but the insecurity in her voice and the way she avoided Sophia's gaze only confirmed the young woman's suspicions. Although Lucia denied any kind of inappropriate relationship, doubt was already planted in Sophia's mind. After that night, the situation became even more unsustainable. Sophia began to pay attention to every gesture and every word between her mother and her boyfriend, looking for signs that would confirm her fears. Martin and Lucia, for their part, tried to distance themselves a little, but the connection between them was so strong that any attempt to end it seemed useless. They both knew they were on the verge of being discovered, but the attraction was still stronger than reason. Finally, in a moment of desperation, Lucia tried to talk to Martin about the possibility of ending their relationship. She explained that she loved her daughter and could not continue to hurt her in this way, but at the same time, the pain of separating from Martin was unbearable. Deep inside, Lucia knew she had to make a drastic decision, but indecision and the fear of losing what had meant so much to her kept her trapped in a cycle of suffering and contradiction. Martin, although he also felt that the romance had reached a critical point, could not imagine himself without those moments shared with Lucia. They were both aware that sooner or later the truth would come to light and the consequences would be devastating. The tension between them, the guilt and the fear of being discovered had become too heavy a burden that they both knew they could not bear for much longer. Finally, the situation became unsustainable, and Sophia, who had been carefully observing every gesture and every look between her mother and her boyfriend for days, decided to face her suspicions. One night, while Lucia and Martine were secretly exchanging messages, Sophia, in a moment of intuition, took her mother's phone and discovered the truth. Seeing the loving and passionate messages they were both sending each other, her heart broke into 1,000 pieces. The betrayal she felt came not only from Martin, but also from the person she trusted most in the world, her mother. Sophia did not know how to react at that moment. Her mind was filled with images and memories of her relationship with Martin, but, above all, of the relationship with her mother, which now felt like a lie. She felt alone, humiliated and betrayed by the two people who meant everything to her. In her desperation, Sophia ran out of the house, without saying a word, leaving behind the phone that had exposed the clandestine relationship. Upon learning that Sophia had discovered everything, Lucia and Martin tried to find her, desperate to explain themselves. Lucia knew that she had hurt her daughter in an irreparable way and that no attempt at an apology could repair the damage she had caused. She felt trapped between love and guilt, not knowing how to face the consequences of her decisions. For his part, Martin was also devastated, feeling responsible for having betrayed Sophia's trust, someone he had sincerely loved, even though her actions said otherwise. After hours of searching, Lucia and Martin found Sophia in a nearby park, sitting alone and silent, with a lost look. The young woman barely looked up when they approached, and her face showed the pain and desperation of someone who had lost everything in an instant. Lucia tried to talk to her, but the words stuck in her throat, unable to find a way to explain the inexplicable. Finally, Sophia looked at them with tears in her eyes and asked them how they could do something so cruel to her. How was it possible that her mother and her boyfriend betrayed her like that? Lucia tried to explain that it had been a mistake, that she didn't want to hurt her, but Sophia couldn't hear her. The betrayal she felt was too deep, and every word from her mother only increased her pain. Martin also tried to apologize, but Sophia, with a coldness he had never seen in her, told him that she could never forgive him. Sophia's words resonated like blows to the hearts of Lucia and Martin, who understood at that moment the extent of their actions. Sophia fell into a deep depression in the following days. The young woman, who was previously cheerful and full of life, now barely left her room and avoided her mother and any contact with Martin. Her life had become a whirlwind of painful emotions, and, despite her mother's attempts to reach out and offer help, Sophia rejected her harshly, refusing to even look her in the eyes. Lucia, consumed by guilt, tried to find help for Sophia, contacting therapists and trusted friends to help her cope with the situation. However, Sophia seemed increasingly distant and desolate, trapped in a spiral of pain that not even time seemed able to heal. Every day that passed, Lucia regretted her decisions, realizing that she had broken her daughter's heart and, with it, all the happiness they once shared. Despite the psychological help that Sophia began to receive, the pain was still unbearable for her. In her mind, the betrayal had destroyed not only her relationship with Martin, but also her connection with her mother, who had always been her role model and refuge. Unable to overcome the suffering, one day Sophia made the tragic decision to end her life, leaving a note in which she expressed the pain and incomprehension that had led her to that outcome. The news of Sophia's death shattered Lucia and Martin in an irreversible way. Both were devastated, aware that their actions had led the young woman to a point of no return. The loss of Sophia meant a wound for Lucia that could never heal. The house, once filled with laughter and happy moments, now felt empty and gloomy, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had destroyed their lives. Unable to bear the guilt and pain, Martin decided to distance himself from Lucia. He understood that their relationship had been a mistake, an obsession that had led them both into a destructive spiral. Although he still felt a deep affection for Lucia, he knew that they could never be happy together after what had happened. Memories of Sophia and the tragedy they had caused would haunt them forever, and the only way to redeem themselves, in his mind, was to put distance between them. Lucia and Martin ended their relationship, each facing the weight of guilt and regret alone. Lucia sank into a life marked by pain and the memory of her daughter, aware that her decision had destroyed the most important bond in her life. Martin, for his part, walked away from the place and all the memories that tied him to his past, trying to rebuild his life despite the tragedy that had marked him forever. The neighborhood, once so full of happy and carefree moments, became a dark place for Lucia. Her life, once dedicated to her family and her daughter's happiness, was left empty and full of regret. The story of Lucia and Martin became a painful lesson about the limits of love and the consequences of impulsive decisions. And although both would move on, each of them would carry with them the memory of Sophia, a young woman whose life was shattered by the betrayal of those